Hi, everyone. This is the Wellbeing Designers podcast. My name is Reka Deák. I am your host. In the first season of the podcast, we will meet the first generation of well-being leaders. They are the ones who are called head of well-being or similar in big organizations. Their responsibility is to navigate through the growing amount of well-being offerings to create value for employees while also keeping the executive leadership team engaged about the topic of well-being. They are proving that investing into well-being pays off and creates sustainable performance and business success. They are well-being designers. This is the sixth episode of the Wellbeing Designers podcast. Our guest today is Newton Cheng, who is a husband and a father, a competitive powerlifter, and a director of health and performance at Google. He has spent his 14-year career at Google developing, launching, and scaling global programs aimed at helping Googlers to thrive. Google has over 170,000 employees worldwide in more than 70 offices in over 50 countries around the globe. Today, Newton spends much of his time exploring how Google can leverage spaces and services, community, culture, and technology to support the physical, mental, social, and spiritual health of Googlers, their families, and neighbors. As a power lifter, he has set multiple world, US, and California state records and is a world and four-time US national champion. He takes a special interest in the intersections of human performance and spirituality and is an advocate for speaking vulnerably about mental health. He earned a BS in electrical engineering and an MBA from University of California, Berkeley. Welcome, Newton, to the show.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
We are really excited to have you here. How did you get into this world of well-being and organizational well-being?
I'm very much inspired by my dad and my mom. So we grew up in a small town in Illinois, and they were both family doctors, and they owned a local medical practice. And it was really normal in my childhood to be walking through the grocery store and to have people stop me and say, "Oh, you're Dr. Chang's son. He really helped me," or "Your mom really helped my mom when she really needed care." And so what that communicated to me was it's really important for us to take care of each other and to take care of people in our local community. And so I wanted to find a path to do that. I didn't choose medicine. I was an electrical engineer. That's what I studied in college. And I worked as an electrical engineer for about 6 years. But what I found was that I chose that because I was very good at math and science, but it kept me kind of separate from that mission of serving people and taking care of them more directly. So in parallel, I started exploring careers specifically in the commercial fitness industry to start with. And what I saw was there was this opportunity in the corporate space where in commercial fitness, you needed to sell memberships or products. But in the corporate space, the incentives were aligned, where corporations wanted their employees to be healthier and employees wanted a better quality of life. And so I tried to find opportunities there. I went to business school to try to build more business skills while trying to better understand how did that ecosystem work. And then coming out of business school, I was really fortunate to find this role at Google working on their health and well-being amenities.
How does the powerlifting connect to your path in the corporate well-being? How did you use that side of yourself?
I've always had some activity that where I really wanted to push myself, both in terms of seeing what I could achieve, but also kind of just like a self mastery and exploration exercise. I've gotten way too into many activities. Like I used to brew my own beer. I used to take a lot of cooking classes. More in terms of physical movement, I was a breakdance performer instructor for about 10 years. And then when my
Wow.
body couldn't tolerate that anymore, I moved into powerlifting. And what I found was that there were a few things. Like, you could become superhumanly strong and do it for a long time. You can keep getting stronger at least well into your 50s, if not beyond. And there are many athletes pushing the limits of that right now. The other things that I've learned as I've got further into it is a lot of the mindsets that I learned from powerlifting and figuring out how you keep attaining higher and higher levels of strength, even when you should be plateauing because your technical expertise is very high, or your body, like, you can't add more muscle mass and keep your frame within your weight class. You need to do a lot of deeper technical mastery that is very specific to you, that has not been discovered by the general sport. And then you have to go deep inside yourself to understand, why do I want to continue this journey? Because it is very difficult and it's costing me a lot. And why is it still worth it? And so by going on those two paths, I find I keep learning much, much more about myself, about how progress and mastery happen. And so that definitely spills into how I show up as a husband and father, as well as a leader in the workplace.
Thank you for elaborating on this. So we talk about Google, and you joined the company 14 years ago. Google has the reputation to be one of the best employers in the world, who is, taking care of the employees. And maybe could you summarize it in your words? What do you think? Why is well-being already maybe 14 years ago? Why was well-being there on the top of the agenda for the company, and how this evolved?
I think so much credit goes to our founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who from the get-go, you can go search on Google for the early stories of when they were envisioning the workplace. And even when Google was just a startup and they were starting to bring together their team, there were activities baked into the culture, such as they would play sports together. They would do roller hockey in the parking lots as breaks. Even when they were both maybe in their late 20s and neither of them had families yet, they were already saying things like, someday when we're bigger, we'll do things like have support programs for moms and childcare and things like that. So they were already thinking in really progressive, innovative ways about how to take care of people, not just within the workplace experience, but across their entire lives. And so that really set the tone for the conversation going forward. Now, the way I experience it now, if I just zoom out and think about how organizations think about health and well-being of individuals versus how we're trying to change that conversation, is that we can often think of an organization as a machine, and it's made up of different functions and parts. And then if you keep zooming in, you get all the way down to specific individuals. And somewhere the mindset often doesn't change. Like, you still see those individuals as resources or machines that are like, each of these is almost like a robot with a certain set of capabilities and capacity. However, like you and I both know, each of these individuals are not robots. They're full color human beings with physical, emotional, social, and spiritual needs. And so the way an organization is designed, and you can think of the culture, its ways of working, it can have a massive influence on our ability to get those needs met in both good and bad ways. So the way I think of it is, there's this old saying of, if you take care of the people, they will take care of the business. And I think the traditional way of thinking about that is a lot around compensation and benefits, which are extremely, extremely important. But we need to think more holistically about that and think about, and what are their physical, social, emotional, and spiritual needs? And how is our organization designed in a way to support those? And if you do that right, productivity and well-being are synergistic and can support each other. They do not have to be at odds.
Very well said. Were there any, periods during these 14 years at Google when you experienced that well-being is more on the agenda, maybe through some challenges that the organization went through, or less, or was it constant?
It's been constant, but the conversation has continually changed. So when I joined Google, I think the most cutting edge framing for health and well-being that I saw was, I'd call it the corporate athlete space,
Mm,
where it looked
yeah.
at the interaction of how you manage someone's health and well-being and how that enables them to show up and perform cognitively at higher levels. And so a lot of the work that I did for the first few years was thinking about how do we connect what we're doing with our amenities around things like movement and recovery with the benefits to people in their core jobs. What I saw after a few years, and we started looking at, hey, which of our programs are the stickiest and have the highest engagement? A lot of them had like a really deep social and community component. And the way we thought about that first was, oh, okay, so if we design our programs to have a strong community component, they'll get higher engagement. Now, as we entered the mid 2010s and you saw the loneliness epidemic start to grow, we started to shift our mindset to say, hey, I don't think the community aspect is just a way to improve engagement for your programs. It's a core need in and of itself, because so many of us are increasingly socially isolated and even lonely. Now, as we've gone into the pandemic, this started happening even years before the pandemic, but the pandemic accelerated all of this. We started to see the trends around mental health and burnout rise really dramatically. And so it kind of went from where we were trying to be proactive about the conversation around health and well-being to suddenly we now feel like, oh, this is a huge rising challenge. And maybe the ways we've thought about supporting the health and well-being of our community, while I believe we were trying to be progressive and we were following best practice, you can see the world is in a much different place and we're all collectively struggling with our mental health. McKinsey says that 59% of us have had one mental health struggle. Uh, Microsoft says 1 out of 2 of us roughly are struggling with burnout at work. And that's a survey of 20,000 workers globally. So this is a huge increase versus what we were seeing years before the pandemic. And not to say that a Google or any single organization can solve this on their own. This is clearly a societal trend. But the conversation we should be having is, if this is our current situation and it's probably going to take a while to change, how do we think about how we support the health and well-being of our community differently than we have in the past?
I love that you brought in this higher responsibility that we all have in the society. This is much bigger than you and I now talking about your company's well-being. This was one of my motivation as well to start this podcast, because the world needs to hear these conversations. This is something that maybe, some companies already realized, Google very early. Some companies have to get on this train in the next years.
Absolutely.
What you have done during these 14 years, starting from the corporate athlete framework, going through the community approach, and now into tackling loneliness and mental health in the past years. Could you tell us some examples that you would highlight that were really effective, so that we can all learn a bit based on Google's experience?
There was a pilot we ran during the pandemic, and we're trying to figure out how to, I'll actually call it a prototype, because I think what we wanted to do is launch something and see what type of value it created, and then figure out how do we take what we learned from that and bake it into more programs. So there's an author, Charles Vogel, who wrote 2 books that I really love. He's written several books, but the 2 that I most often reference are The Art of Community, as
Mhm.
well as Building Brand Communities. Charles has a master's in divinity from Yale. And via that background, he's gone and looked at a variety of spiritual traditions to look at what are some of the common aspects around how all these spiritual traditions bring together and maintain a really rich, tight knit community. in building brand communities, he gets a little more specific and pragmatic of like, can I start to move in the direction of giving you a playbook on how you would actually build and nurture communities that look like what I'm talking about in art of community. So one of the things that he came up with in building brand communities was this concept of campfires, where if you use the mental image of people sitting around a campfire, there's like a certain boundary to that. Like, you're all in proximity to this, beautiful flame that's providing warmth. There's probably a limited number of you. And then there's an intimacy of the conversation that happens around that campfire. And so he gives some guidelines on, putting the actual physical fire aside. How would you create that experience of these small groups? And it really involves, I think, first setting expectations about what the group is, curating who comes into the group, and then having someone carefully facilitate the group discussion. During the pandemic, when we were all going to be physically isolated, we created this prototype program where we had people join campfires with trained facilitators. And what we found was it was really, really successful at helping people build meaningful connections and have meaningful conversations with one another, which was so needed, especially at that time during the pandemic. Now, as we move forward, what we're trying to do is take what we learned from that and figure out, okay, how do we bake some of that magic into more of our programs? So what we're trying to do now is build out a whole community function that sits parallel to the other amenities that I run. So it's kind of like if you think of us almost like a matrix organization, it's something that's layered on top of, our fitness programs, our recovery programs, our meditation programs, to show like not just can we use community to make those programs more engaging, but can we bake community into those programs so people are getting their key social health needs met via those programs?
I had a big smile on my face while you were talking because actually I was working with the campfire concept as well in a previous role that I had at Novartis. So
That's
yeah,
that's awesome. Yes, it's a really powerful concept.
yeah, I totally agree. It was very popular and powerful there as well. How is well-being connected to other areas in your organization? You have a huge organization, so we have to acknowledge that. Can you tell us a bit more where does it sit? Just to give a context to the listeners, you mentioned compensation and benefit is something where maybe it used to be, but I still see, job advertisements where they have this role in the compensation team. Some of them, they have it at diversity and inclusion. So I'm really curious, how is the setup in your case?
So Google is a massively decentralized, high empowerment organization. And what that looks like is you have some central functions. So for example, my organization is called the Health and Performance Organization, and it sits under our larger real estate and workplace services umbrella. We have sister teams such as our benefits team that sits in our people operations organization. We have people development that also sits in our um, people operations organization. And then we have employee health and safety, and that sits under our larger security organization. So these are just some of the central functions that are there to directly support the health and well-being of members of our community. You had brought up DEI, and we do have a central DEI function that also sits under people operations. However, now beyond this, I think both the power, but then also a complexifying factor of doing this work at Google is that organizations, whether they be product areas or other central functions, are free to spin up their own work related to whether it's health and well-being, DEI, DEIB, or the intersection of the two. And so on the one hand, you have much higher level engagement and ownership because leaders throughout the company who have said, I'm going to resource this for my organization. Like now they have dedicated resourcing. On the other hand, keeping all of those teams somewhat knit together so that we're, where it makes sense, building in alignment and building together. We're not duplicating, and we're also learning from one another. That becomes this huge, huge complexity challenge. The summary is like there's some central functions. It's a little bit of everywhere, which is ultimately it's better than it being nowhere, but it's a really big challenge.
Do you have any central framework or some principles that you follow to tackle this complexity?
I work on a team of some of those central functions that have come together, who are both bringing that together, and then it will also be on us to do the socialization and alignment work, which is honestly that type of thing takes years and is never done. So I'll say yes, and there's a lot of work to do.
You mentioned spirituality, and you already mentioned it in your bio that you are really focusing on that intersection. I would like to elaborate a bit on this because in my work, for instance, when I started to deal with organizational well-being, also with the corporate athlete framework, which has on the top of the triangle the spiritual part, I was very careful, to talk about this in a corporate context because people might then close down. How is your experience on this? How you really embody this spiritual approach in your work?
Yeah, so this, I'll say, part of this, as I push on the topic of spiritual health, part of it is professional, part just aligns with my personal values. The way that I think about spirituality or spiritual health is what is quality of your connection with yourself, others, and something greater that knits us together. I make sure that I have that definition, which is a non-religious, secular framing. But still, if you go into it, it can be deeply meaningful and powerful. Like it's almost an infinitely explorable topic. Now, as I've brought in the workplace, I think the things that I'm careful to do are I have both. I have research based, and I have secular, and I have non-secular references for this topic, because depending on where the person's at, I need some different way to engage them. So in terms of secular experts on this, there's a researcher from Harvard Divinity Lab named Casper ter Kuile. And so my definition of spiritual health is a slight modification of his definition of secular spirituality. From the more religious spiritual tradition space, I reference an author named Richard Rohr, who is a Franciscan priest, but also does research across spiritual traditions, much like Charles Vogel. And then finally, if I just need to go with research, I reference the Harvard Flourishing Index, where they've looked at a variety of different factors that show evidence to meaningfully improve the health and well-being of individuals. And so they have a category under the Harvard Flourishing Index of character and virtue. And a lot of that points to spiritual practice. And so I have a variety of ways for people to enter that conversation. Now, in terms of getting somewhere in this conversation, I had to be a little brave and just say, I'm just going to keep putting this on the table, even though I know it makes you uncomfortable. And the thing that I challenge people with is, yes, you can ask, is it the place of the corporation to bring this up? The way I like to frame the conversation is, what can we agree on? Can we agree that this is important for humans? Our connection with ourselves, each other, and something greater that knits us together. Very hard to argue with that. So I usually get broad agreement on that. The second question is, does a employer need to take responsibility for that? My response to that is always, the employer gets to choose. You can decide what's in bounds and out of bounds. But there's good evidence that poor spiritual health, a lack of connection to yourself, others, and something greater, points to poor well-being. So the employer will be negatively affected by the negative outcomes of that poor connection. So if you're already being affected by the downside, do you want to try to influence this so you can also reap the benefits of the upside?
Meeting people where they are. I really like that approach and it resonates with me. You have all the palette with you, and then you offer tools and the frameworks for each individual accordingly, what resonates with them. Hmm.
Yes, meeting them where they're at. That's a really good way of putting it.
You mentioned now a lot of research and the Harvard Flourishing Index. This brings me to the next question about measurement. Uh, how do you measure the outcome of your work?
We struggle with this just as much as many other organizations. And because we are so sensitive to privacy, we have higher bars to pass than many other organizations. And so if you look at the more conventional measures for this field, we follow a lot of these same ones: presenteeism, absenteeism, health risks, and associated healthcare costs. If you go to an organization called the Health Enhancement Research Organization, they really did some pioneering work on this that was really game changing, that they put out as early as the late 90s. And I think we are still wed to a lot of that. Now, if I look at, again, I cited that research around, hey, 1 out of 2 of us is burned out. I think we need to go deeper and maybe look at this in some different ways. We're not doing these things yet, but some work that's compelling to me is there's an author and researcher, Christina Maslach from uh, University of California, Berkeley. And she's the author of a book called The Burnout Challenge that summarizes decades of work she's done about burnout, specifically in the workplace. And she calls out there's some leading indicators to show that some people might be burning out: exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy. Now, if you can see those things and you say, okay, if I am responsible for the health and well being of an organization, how would I manage these things? You now have to go beyond just the central health and well being function and think about how is the organization more largely designed? Because the 6 key factors of managing exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy are workload, the individual's sense of control, their sense of reward, community, fairness, and then alignment with values. And you can see now, like, okay, this was a conversation about health and well-being, but if we are struggling with rates of burnout at this level and need to start addressing that, you have to go beyond the health and well-being programs and start to look at the fundamental design of ways of working of your organization.
It really resonates with the previous people who were on this podcast. And I have to say it's music for my ears, because how we started many years ago to talk about well-being. What is this? Yoga classes or Jimabo? Yeah, we came a long way.
I think the next gap is to say, when, depending on the business leader I'm talking to, if I start to say things like, we need to look at things like workload, there's a tension there of you as the leader, like, yes, there's a heavy workload and you're responsible for figuring out how your team gets that done. On the other hand, if your team is potentially going to burn out, or some people are going to burn out, this becomes a big workforce planning problem. And so, you can think of it as do the right thing. I don't want people to burn out. You can also think of this as just very much pragmatic for the organization, of like, okay, if people are burning out, their capacity is going to be suboptimal, either by a little bit, or if they go on leave, by a lot. The gap we need to get over is, like, one, acknowledging, like, hey, the math is not going to work out on this equation. And then two, figuring out how do we actually put this topic on the table. And beyond just workload planning, there's a huge stigma component about this that needs to be addressed. Of, you say, like, why is the way we're managing the workload not congruent with people being able to take care of themselves? I think the starting point is creating an environment where people can, again, openly express their physical, emotional, social, and spiritual needs, and how that is being supported or not supported by the workplace. And not to say the workplace can solve for all of that, but you can't solve a problem if you can't talk about it. And right
Mm.
now we can't because of stigma.
This is also a topic which is coming up again and again in our talks. Where is the borderline between individual and corporate organizational responsibility in terms of well-being? You already gave us a lot of ideas, so I think anyone listens to the podcast comes out stronger and smarter. But still, I would like to ask you, what would be your ultimate advice to future well-being leaders who are getting this role in the future?
I'd say understand the industry and know the past of what got us here. Moving forward, for us to really drive change, I think we need to think of ourselves not just as well-being leaders, but we're leaders of the business, and well-being is an integrated responsibility of that. That's where we need to get to. And depending on where you sit in the organization, these skills will be less about your expertise specifically in well-being and more about how do you influence the business. So if you can't show up as a credible and influential business leader, it's going to be hard for you to drive the change that's needed for us to really help people take care of themselves and each other. So I would say that's a very difficult journey. You need to look at how are you going to show up as a leader, lean into the discomfort of challenging the organization. And in the process, you're probably going to face a lot of failures. And so you're going to have to ask yourself, if you want to do this work, the safe thing to do will be implement programs, try to get the organization to adopt them, and then blame the organization for them not being as successful as they could be if they're not widely adopted. The actual work will be leaning in and continually challenging the organization, even when it pushes back on you, and continuing to do it, because that is the work of change.
What about you, your personal well-being approach? How do you take care of yourself?
There's a few things, and I will fully acknowledge I myself have burned out. I've been on mental health leave, and I continue to run pretty fast despite that. And so I'm doing a lot of work on myself to understand like what is driving me, because some of that is good and some of it is still challenging to my health and well-being. So what I would recommend to people, and this is the journey I'm on learning about myself, is you can start by trying to adopt all the right lifestyle behaviors, movement, curing your mindset, nutrition, sleep and recovery. However, that's going to quickly lead to overwhelm, both in the quantity and complexity of all those factors. Now, I find it more useful to reflect on the key roles in my life: husband and father, competitive athlete, and leader in workplace well-being, and try to understand not just how I show up at my best in each of those roles, but how they both reinforce and balance each other. So, for example, I know husband and father has to be the priority, because those, my partner, my children, they're the most important thing to me. I put competitive athlete as second most important, even though it pays me nothing, because to do that well, I have to do a lot of the lifestyle behaviors right.
Well,
And then I put,
it pays you nothing. Sorry to interrupt in terms of money, but I guess it pays you a lot, like in your mental strengths.
yes, actually, that's a really great point. Yes, it pays me no money. And then leader in the workplace, even though I am incredibly passionate about my career, I have to keep telling myself that is in third place, because the way I'm wired is that will keep trying to claw its way up the ladder and take over the other two factors. So that is work I'm doing on myself to strengthen that boundary and strengthen those priorities. But for now, what I do is I articulate that framework to myself and others so that I'm accountable to keeping it that way. Now that's my framework, and it's working pretty well for the life I want to build. You can't adopt my framework. You have to find your own. And a lot of that's going to be, again, self-knowledge, and it's going to be about building your capacity to handle complexity in your life.
I can just support what you said. For me, self-awareness is really key to well-being. So yeah, thanks a lot. I am so happy that you accepted this invite and we had this conversation. And in the future, we would love to have you back and continue this conversation with your newest learnings.
I would love to do it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed this episode of the Wellbeing Designers podcast. We have come a long way since we started the podcast end of 2022. I have some big news for you. We will have a live podcast conversation on the Wellbeing at Work Summit in Zurich, 25th of May. There will be an old and some new guests involved into the panel discussion. If you are around, come and join us in person on this event. You can find more details on the homepage www.wellbeingatwork.world. Let's design the future of well-being together. To join the movement of the Wellbeing Designers, reach out via LinkedIn or via email hello@rekadeak, rekadeak.com. I am keen to hear about your stories, your ideas, and feedbacks. Our new website will be launched soon. I will let you know when you can check it out. In the meantime, sign up on Spotify, Apple, Google, or Amazon, so you will be notified about the next episode. And we will have a surprise guest on our next show. I can't wait to share who this person is with you. So bear with me, and together we can design the future of well-being and make workplaces fit for humans.